Susan Bradley here in Toronto, child psychiatrist, all psychotherapies, psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral, experiential, interactional, show a similarity in promoting affect regulation. And so the relevance of these developmental attachment studies to the psychotherapeutic process lies in the commonality of the right brain to right brain emotional communications between the mother and the infant, and then later between the patient and the therapist, as the attachment now comes back expressed in the Therapeutic Alliance. And we now know, incidentally, that the major vector of improvement in psychotherapy is the Therapeutic Alliance. It's the relationship between the patient and the therapist, the emotional relationship. That's at the core, much more than insight, just for the record. In current therapeutic models, affects are the center of empathic communication, and the regulation of conscious and unconscious feelings is placed in the center of the clinical stage. Well, here you see my colleague Doug Watt, neuropsychoanalyst. Empathy has long been hypothesized as a critical and possibly the most critical outcome variable from the therapist's side in the therapeutic interaction in many schools of psychotherapy. And my colleague and co-researcher Russell Mears in Australia, the therapist's capacity for empathy is the principal agent of beneficial change in the patient. And I want to suggest that Roots of Empathy is also attempting to expand this right brain function in children and adolescents. There's empathic ability has remained infantile. That is, if she tends to respond not with regulation, but with panic to the baby's anxiety, then a deleterious chain will be set into motion. Think about a context of abuse. She may chronically wall herself off from the baby, thus depriving him of the beneficial effect of merging with her as she returns from experiencing mild anxiety to calmness. Alternatively, she may continue to respond with panic, in which case two negative consequences may ensue. And again, he's talking about here, what if there is early abuse and neglect, which would be, again, the most severe form of attachment trauma. The mother may lay the groundwork in the child for a lifelong propensity toward the uncurbed spreading of anxiety or other emotions, or by forcing the child to wall himself off from such an overly intense and thus traumatizing experience. The child now dissociates. She may foster in the child an impoverished psychic organization. The psychic organization of a person who will later be unable to be empathic himself to other human beings, to experience human experiences, in essence, to be fully human. Again, empathy out of the attachment lies at the core of literally what it means to be human with other humans. So the last part of this, again, would move towards the repair of the self. And here you see in 1990, in the Psychological Bulletin, Semrad Kleichman, the emotional experiences of the infant develops through the sounds, images, and pictures that constitute much of an infant's early learning experience and are disproportionately stored or processed in the right hemisphere during the formative stages of brain ontogeny. Again, in implicit procedural memories, much of this at the subcortical level, much of this at the level of the right amygdala, the major fear center of the brain. The right hemisphere does enter into later growth state spurts, not quite as much as the first. as then the left comes into its growth spurt also in the second year. The early forming right brain attachment system, therefore, can be shaped by later relationships. I do not mean to say that this all sets up and then there's no plasticity. There is plasticity left in the system. In childhood and adolescence, an individual is exposed to emotional sensitivity in a caring, empathic relationship with another human being, usually someone older. The right brain can use this to build an attachment bond, and this allows for further right brain development. Here you see the right first in a growth spurt, then it goes left on the top of the graph, but then it comes back. So there is plasticity in the system. And actually, in the attachment literature, there is a term called earned secure attachments. These are people who are born with the worst of all possible beginnings, but then because of an important contact that they make with a human being who empathically can resonate with them and form a bond, they become earned secures and actually parent as secures. Actually, psychotherapy is about the conversion of insecures into earned secures. So I have suggested that this emotional right brain, and not the linguistic left, is dominant in psychotherapy. In 1909, Freud said psychotherapy is all about emotion, and fundamentally it's about emotion. So here we have Graham Taylor, psychiatrist here in Toronto, who's done remarkable work on alexithymia. Affect dysregulation is a fundamental mechanism of all psychiatric disorders. In 2001, in the Infant Mental Health Journal, I wrote an article in which I coined the term, the effects of early relational trauma on right brain development, affect regulation, and infant mental health. And here I was really thinking not so much about trauma that comes from the physical environment as the trauma that comes from the emotional environment, when the primary caregiver, the haven of safety, is a source of not regulation but dysregulation. And so this relational attachment trauma interferes with the organization of these same cortical, subcortical, right brain, limbic autonomic circuits. And it compromises from infancy onward the capacities not only of attachment, but also the capacity to play, and notice the capacity for empathy and affect regulation. This imprints a permanent physiological reactivity of the right brain and a susceptibility to later disorders of affect regulation, expressed in a deficit in the capacity to cope with the kinds of stressors that come from human relationships. The best current description of the path of neurodevelopment is not that all brains are resilient, but that all brains are malleable. Again, for better or worse. So I'm listing very quickly, these are some of the fundamental survival functions of the right brain. If the left brain is involved in language functions and voluntary muscle movements, etc., the right brain is involved in the communication, the processing of facial expressions, prosodies, and gestures, which again, Roots of Empathy is focusing on these aspects of communication. The regulation of central and autonomic arousal, because again, in PTSDs, etc., what you're seeing is autonomic arousal dysregulation. The storage of implicit procedural emotional memory, the processing of novelty. It is now thought that familiar stimuli are processed by the left hemisphere, but novel stimuli, the ability to learn something new, are processed by the right, but also threat and unexpected stimuli. In fact, the regulation of the human stress response and cortisol release also is processed in the right brain, and the reception and the expression and the communications of negative affects and pain. Indeed, the control of vital functions supporting survival and enabling the organism to cope actively and passively with stress by the right. And this is why, again, the right sets up early in development through the attachment relationship. Now, the point I want to make here is that as opposed to the optimal situation that I alluded to first, if there is attachment trauma, it's these functions that are impaired. The lifespan, as Bowlby said, these internal working models of attachment are established. The baby uses, and we all use at later points in time, these internal working models of attachment, and they are stored in implicit procedural memory. They're not stored in declarative, linguistic, semantic memory, but in the right brain, in implicit procedural memory. This internal working model is used by all human beings as strategies of affect regulation that non-consciously guide us throughout life in various affectively charged environments, and that we use these mechanisms with all human beings, especially in intimate, that beneath the words that are going on, we're also reading the nonverbal communications that are being sent back and forth between us. And actually now, this has now become a part of psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is now, again, the therapist is reading beneath the words, so to speak, and attempting, as Bowlby said, to change the internal working models from insecure to secure. Again, in all later stages of development, this attachment representation, again acting at levels beneath conscious awareness, is access to appraise, interpret, and regulate social emotional information. It is not done as well by the conscious left linguistic mind as it is by the rational mind, as it is by the emotional brain, and that this internal working model guides human interactions, especially in familiar and in novel interpersonal environments. Now, along the line, there have been a number of studies establishing also that optimal ability to regulate stress is dependent upon right hemispheric specialization in regulating stress and emotion related processes. There is very good evidence that when it comes to low levels of stress or moderate levels of stress, we use our left brains. But when it gets down to intense stress, we shift right into the right brain, and we're tapping into our early internal working models that are based on our early experiences. So again, it's this right side of this chart. You see the right hemisphere, which is connected into the emotion processing limbic system and into the brain stem, the regulation of arousal and pain system. It is that right vertical circuit, I'm suggesting, which is set up by the attachment. These adaptive right brain survival functions, and again, the survival functions are on the right, and that's why nature has literally set the right up first and then to the left, are initially imprinted in these right brain to right brain attachment communications during these early critical periods of infancy. And as I alluded to before, because the brain growth spurt starts in the last trimester, we're now looking at also working with mothers in pregnancy to begin to look at the establishment of emotional well-being in the infant. So here you see the mirror neuron researchers DiPreto. Typically, developing children can rely upon a right hemisphere mirroring neural mechanism interfacing with the emotion processing limbic system and the insula, which is tied into the autonomic nervous system, whereby the meaning of imitated or observed emotion is directly felt and hence understood. Another study by Uden, the emergent picture from the current literature seems to suggest a special role of the right hemisphere in self-related cognition, essentially the idea of self, my own perception of self, in own body perception, in the ability to read one's own body's cues, in self-awareness being right brain, and also autobiographical memories, our history of our lives, so to speak, not the narrative in the left, but literally the emotional narrative, the emotional experiences are stored in the right brain, which is why therapists are so interested now in the right brain. But even more than that, the right hemisphere operates a distributed network for rapid responding to danger and urgent problems. The right preferentially processes environmental challenge, stress, and pain, and manages self-protective responses such as avoidance and escape. Again, this is not the later linguistic left, this is the right. This is found, again, in all mammals. Emotionality is just the right brain's red phone, compelling the mind to handle urgent matters without delay. And therefore, we're saying that a dysregulation of the right brain will be occurring in various fear-based psychopathologies. Maternal love also activates the insula, an area involved in gut feelings or of emotive states. She uses these gut feelings to intuitively read her baby's states. But also, the insula is activated in what is called limbic touch, which is pleasant feelings of touch and caress, skin-to-skin contact between individuals. Now, she's looking at the face, and the part that feels touch is being activated. You understand what I'm saying? She's not even touching the baby, but those strong associations are there to those areas being activated. She is literally feeling the baby in these areas of her body through this strong association of this intense emotion. Maternal love also activates the anterior cingulate, suggesting a potential link to the mother's feeling of empathy and urge to care for her infant. The cingulate, or there's much been written these days about empathy, obviously, so that part of the brain that's involved in empathy is now activated here, but also the urge now to care for her infant, to tend for the infant, etc. It also activates the ventral tegmental dopamine neurons, which are, as you know, are associated with highly rewarding experiences. That, just looking at that face, activates highly rewarding experiences. Also, the periaqueductal gray, which is involved in endogenous pain suppression during intense emotional experiences. That even during the intense emotional experiences, her ability here to be able to feel not only the joy of the baby, but also to be able to feel the pain of the baby, to feel the negative affect of the baby. As you'll see, it's more than, love is going to turn out to be more than just positive emotions. It's also the ability to feel the negative emotions of this baby, to feel that the baby is in distress, and how to tend to that, what to do about that. Is that distress due to hunger? Is it a cry for to come and to touch, et cetera, et cetera? So we're seeing that area is also involved. The periaqueductal gray also suppresses pain. This area is involved actually in childbirth and makes the pain of the childbirth somewhat tolerable. Maternal love also now deactivates certain parts of the brain in the right hemisphere. These deactivations, the part of the brain, of the mother's brain, as she's looking at this face, that are switched off, as opposed to switched on, are the middle prefrontal, inferior parietal, and middle temporal cortices in the right hemisphere, as well as the posterior cingulate cortex that plays a predominant role in cognition. The part of her that thinks, that's involved in cognition, is shut down. She is feeling. She is not attempting to intellectually understand at that point in time. The second part that's deactivated, the amygdala, the temporal pole, the parieto-temporal, mesial prefrontal, has been associated with negative emotions. So the negative emotions are being shut off, obviously, but also they're found in theory of mind. So theory of mind and mentalizing is shut off while she is engaged with this baby. We're hearing a lot about theory of mind in psychotherapy, but that system is off. Her relationship here, her empathy is purely bodily based empathy. It's not cognitive empathy. It's not thinking empathy. And then maternal love deactivates negative emotion. The amygdala is reliably activated in neuroimaging studies involving negative emotions, aggression, and fear. So aggression and fear is going to be shut down now while she's looking at this face. 2004, same year, done here in the University of Wisconsin, orbital frontal cortex tracks positive mood in mothers viewing pictures of their newborn infant. And they go on to say that positive affect elicited in a mother toward her newborn infant may be one of the most powerful and evolutionarily preserved forms of positive affect in the emotional landscape of human behavior. Notice they're coming back to this. It's not only a positive emotion, it's the strength of this emotion. I mean, the strength of this emotion, very frequently when one is feeling it, is beyond words. When you're looking at a loving face of that infant, poets have difficulty, even poets have difficulty relating the intensity and the power of that emotion. One form of positive emotion is the infant that arises in the mother's relationship with her infant. The form of positive emotion is better characterized by warmth, nurturance, joy, and fulfillment. And I say this because when the mother is in the scanner, they'll ask her, while you're looking at that image, what subjective words come to mind right now in the experience you're in? And it's these kinds of words.
So then the question was, when do people have the feeling they arrive? When do people have the feeling they're really in touch with the supreme principle, the universe? And I found those states fell into two categories, where people really felt they were at the cradle of everything. They either understood what it was about, they had all their questions answered, or they were in a state where there was no need to ask questions, which is the same as understand everything. If you don't have any more questions to ask, you have a sense of understanding, you have a sense of arriving, you have a sense of fulfillment. Now, one of these states was a state which can be called void. Some people, sophisticated people, talk about it as supracosmic and metacosmic void. Means it's emptiness that is supraordinated to everything and also in some sense underlies everything. You can find in Buddhist scriptures statements like form is emptiness and emptiness is form. So there's a state of mind that you can go into in a non-ordinary state of consciousness, which is a state of absolute metaphysical emptiness, nothingness. There's nothing there, yet it's conscious of itself. There's a point of consciousness that's aware of that emptiness. And there's paradoxically also the sense that there's nothing missing in that state. There's potential for all of existence, but none of it is concretized in any way. You can link it to quantum physics. This is exactly what quantum physicists come to, talking about the dynamic void, talking about the probabilities, everything ultimately being just probabilities, but nothing is really manifested until it's observed and so on. So that is one state where you have the feeling there is a sense of understanding where things come from. It's not understanding here, it's experiential understanding of the gut level. This is the source of existence. It comes from nothingness. Now, this is tremendously important in understanding the psychology of Western cultures and in comparison, for example, to the Oriental cultures. We had a meeting in '85 in Kyoto, which was the International Transpersonal Association, and this was the time when there was tremendous conflict between Japan and the United States in business. You remember these difficulties? And they were having conferences trying to straighten it out. And there was a Jungian Japanese psychologist at the conference, Dr. Kawai, and he gave a talk on the differences between the Japanese mind and the Western mind in Jungian terms, in terms of the underlying archetypes, in terms of the underlying mythology. And he showed that the Oriental philosophy is a system with an empty center. Creation comes out of nothing. Creation comes out of emptiness. Our mythology, in the center is the power station. There is creative power. The creation comes out of the creative impulse. And then if you follow that, you get a totally different cosmology that has then reflection on the hierarchies in culture and so on. Whether you see the whole system as being self-supported, interconnected, or whether you see it as a system where you can have selective hierarchical control over things and so on, which is very much the Western psychology. So people who have powerful experiences of the void, they emerged basically with a new philosophy, which is different from Western, and they feel a tremendous resonance with things like the I Ching, which expresses this kind of philosophy, the Taoist type of thinking. Now, when you are in that state, you can also understand how something can come out of nothing, how creation can come out of emptiness. Again, this is something that is absolutely inconceivable for the left hemisphere thinking. You know, that we have a system in science where we believe everything is cause and effect. Only when you take it all the way back, and you're in trouble. Because then you have the question, what was the first cause? What was before the first cause? If there was a first mover, who moved that mover, and so on. And you see the absurdity of the system. Of course, science doesn't deal with it, or didn't deal with it until quantum physics, until people like Hawking and so on talking about, again, creation out of nothing. If you read Steve Hawking, he would say things like, nothingness has no other choice than to create existence. But you don't get very far with the cause and effect thinking, which we are dominated by in science and in our culture. That simply doesn't work. And we just draw a line there. We don't deal with that in science, and we play a game, we think we have it down, everything is very reasonable, and we sort of ignore that big hole. It's like the Sufi story, when a man goes and sees somebody under a lamp, sort of looking for something on the ground. He says, what are you looking for? He says, I'm looking for a key. He says, where did you lose it? He says, over there. He says, why are you looking for it here? He says, well, it's dark there, I wouldn't have a chance. So you have a very reasonable scientific system, only you don't deal with things where you wouldn't have a chance, like you don't ask questions. You just say, well, consciousness somehow comes out of matter, it comes from your brain. You don't ask the question, how does that happen? How can that kind of thing happen? Because you wouldn't have a chance. So you deal with those kinds of manifestations that make sense in your system. So you can talk about causes and effects, except when you go to the beginning. So that kind of thinking doesn't apply. We just will not deal with that stuff.
So I want to end with some thoughts again about this paradigm shift. The right brain and the relational unconscious. The shift is that we are not looking at two halves of one brain, but two very separate processes. The British psychiatrist, neuroscientist Ian McGilchrist says that the differences between the two brain hemispheres is profound. Each creates a coherent, utterly different, and often incompatible versions of the world with competing priorities and values. Ultimately, if the left hemisphere is the hemisphere of what? The right hemisphere with its preoccupation with context, especially relational context. The relational aspects of experience, emotion, and nuances of expression could be said to be the hemisphere of how. Again, left and right. And the truth of it is that the right frontal area is expanded and the left posterior is expanded on the left side. These are two different processors. He says if what one means by consciousness is the part of the mind that brings the world into focus, makes it explicit, allows it to be formulated in language, and is aware of its own awareness, it is reasonable to link the conscious mind to activity, almost all of which lies ultimately in the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere, by contrast, yields a world of individual, changing, evolving, interconnected, implicit, non-conscious, incarnate living beings within the context of the lived world, but in the nature of things never fully graspable, always imperfectly known, and to this world it exists in a relationship of care. And so McGilchrist says, now talking about the right brain, what are the characteristics of this right hemisphere? And McGilchrist also makes the argument that we have become too left brain in our cultures. The idea, the title is The Master and His Emissary. And the idea is that the right hemisphere is the master, the left hemisphere is the emissary, and sometimes the left hemisphere, the emissary, betrays the master. We have been too focused on left hemisphere, which is why I see roots of empathy as also as such a critical need at this point. So the right and not the left is dominant for, and look where he starts again, empathy and intersubjectivity, the ability to read the minds of each other as the ground of consciousness. The importance of an open, patient attention to the world as opposed to a willful, grasping attention. The implicit or hidden nature of truth, the emphasis on process rather than stasis, the journal being more important than the arrival, the primacy of perception, the importance of the body in constituting reality, an emphasis on uniqueness. Again, the right dominant for the objectifying nature of vision, the irreducibility of all value to utility, and creativity as an unveiling, no-saying process rather than a willfully constructive process. Again, this early developing right brain is shaped by attachment experiences. I thank you for your attention.